We don't ever see a case where there's a woman in the scriptures that is exerting authority over man outside of the order that Yah's established. Deborah the prophet, so she has a husband, and if she was in the capacity of being a prophetess of Yah, that means she would have been righteous, which means she would have been following the order and the hierarchy that Yah established in the first place, and would have recognized the male leadership framework of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. And so Deborah, the prophetess, would have been a righteous woman in order to be a prophet. She would have been a righteous woman, which means she would have been under the headship of her husband and would have recognized the leadership framework that Yah established in Torah, which is a leadership of heads of households, men that were over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. And that's the framework that we see in the scripture. About Phoebe, Phoebe is mentioned in Romans 16, verse 1. The Greek word diakonos, it is translated as deacon, but you have to understand this word means it's someone who's executing in the role of a servant, who executes the commands of another, especially of a master. This person is a servant, an attendant, somebody who ministers to people. You see the context of the word deacon, whether it's a male or female, is somebody who's in a serving role, a role of a servant. It's not a leadership position that's overall. Now today's church model and many churches today have created a greater leadership role that they call deacons, and a lot of churches are run by deacons, and they dictate to the pastor what he's supposed to do and not do. But that's not a biblical church model. That's actually an inverted model. The deacons are supposed to be servants. They're supposed to be attendants. They can minister, but they don't exert their will over the pastor or the shepherd of the assembly. So today's church model is not what we're not talking about that. What we're talking about is what we see right here in the first century in our scriptures, and that deacon, Phoebe, and any men that were deacons, they would have been they were in a role where they were serving others, and so we have to make the lines clear here and define the terms clearly. It's a servant. She's a servant of the assembly, a deaconess of the ecclesia or the kahal, and so since this is talking about the kahal, she's not in the role of a pastor or a roeh. She's in the role of a deacon or a servant. And that's what it says in Romans 16:1. When people like to bring up Aquila and Priscilla, they like to throw that out there too. See, Priscilla was over men. Oh, they were working together as husband and wife. Listen, if there's a sister out there that's got a set apart husband and he's in ministry, I would hope that you would be right by his side. You guys should be working together as often as you can. Yes, there are things you have to take care of, responsibilities and children, all these things, but you should be right there as often as you can, right by your husband's side, proclaiming and ministering together. That's what Aquila and Priscilla were doing. It wasn't Priscilla exerting authority over her husband. She was in tandem with her husband, exactly how she was designed to be. And that's what really, I think a lot of these men of Elohim really need that from their wives, maybe even more, the ones that are in ministry or the ones that are praying about ministry, is that we need our wives to come alongside of us and do this together with us as often as they're able to, So we see that model there, right there in the New Testament, and it is not one where it's giving the authority for women to exert themselves, to place themselves over men or exert authority over men. I just think it's good to define some of the different roles, and a good place to start from is Ephesians chapter 4, verse 11 and 12, and it says, and he himself gave some to be apostles, some prophets, some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers for the equipping of the saints, for the work of ministry, for the edifying of the body Messiah. So that a lot of people refer to that as the fivefold ministry or whatever, and there, but it doesn't just stop with those five. There are other roles and capacities as well that are in other scriptures, but people like to point to this and just say there's a fivefold ministry essentially. But it's the idea that we can see there's many different roles, and these can apply. A lot of these can apply to both men and women, but there are some roles that we see if you take into account the scriptures, like you already mentioned, about what the protocol for the assembly looks like. And we can see it clearly in the Torah, by the way, that there was a framework of leadership that was raised up, and it says in the Torah, in many places, in Exodus 18 and Deuteronomy 16 and other places, that the Deuteronomy chapter 1 even, it talks about how these leaders that were raised up were men of men that were not given to ill-gotten gain, men that were not taking bribes, men that feared Yah, and they were heads of households, heads of clans, chiefs of their tribes, chiefs, heads of households. And they were raised up into a framework of leadership over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. And so we see a model here that Yah authenticates in the Torah and says, this is good. This is good to do this, to have a hierarchy like this. And of course, Yah, gave us an established hierarchy of the roles of men and women in the beginning when he created them. And so taking that all into account, we can understand, like with a verse like Ephesians 4, 11 and 12, that there are going to be cases where women can serve in these positions as long as they're doing it in the scriptural order and hierarchy of things. So if they're, as long as there's not an usurping of a leadership role where a man is established, if they're not exerting some authority over a man in one of these capacities, then yes, we know that they can teach. We know that women can go out and preach. They could go out and street preach, just like men. They could go and proclaim the gospel. We know that women can be prophets because we see, Deborah and others in the scriptures. So there are definitely roles that they can fill. The key point here is exerting authority over the leadership hierarchy that Yah has established, with men being in the position of being a pastor or leader over assemblies, and being in the headship role. I think it's important to clearly define those lanes, and if we can define those, then we know we have a better understanding of where people can be. The idea of a pastor, we know that comes from the word shepherd, which in Hebrew is roah, roah, and plural would be roim. And so, for example, in Ezekiel 34, Yah gives a pretty scathing rebuke of the pastors, of the shepherds of Israel, and how they're not doing what they're supposed to do and all these things. And so, as a reference to that word being used in the scriptures. And so when you think about the role of a shepherd, let's look at what a shepherd does. A shepherd, and literally the word roah, it literally means to pasture or graze sheep or herds. So flocks or herds. So it could be also translated as in the English word as herdmen or whatever. So when you're grazing or pasturing flocks, what are you doing? Well, you are facilitating the feeding of that flock or herd of animals. Okay. And so when you pivot over to the spiritual implication of that, for a pastor in that role to be facilitating the feeding of Yah's people, the assembly, okay, to facilitate, in a leadership type role, a caretaker type role, a guiding role, an authoritative role. And when we see, for example, toward the end of the Gospel of John, where Yeshua asked Peter, he asked Kepha, "Do you love me?" He asked him 3 times, "Do you love me?" And every time he says, "Feed my sheep." And so he's obviously establishing a role there for people to act as shepherds, as pastors, to feed the sheep, to help to pasture and graze the people of Yah. But this is not just a New Testament concept, because we see that in the Torah, the word for assembly is called kahal, and a kahal is the same word that's used in the Greek Septuagint. They use the word ecclesia, which is the word in the New Testament that they translate as church. Okay, so you can say what you want about that, but ecclesia is kahal. Kahal is assembly. Okay, and so the assembly of people, Yah raises up a leadership framework, and never once does he say within that leadership framework to raise up women that are heads of households, that are mothers of families, he doesn't say that at all. He says these leaders should be men that are heads of households, men that are not given to bribes, men that fear Yah, and there's other attributes in there. This is in the Torah now, so we're starting from the beginning, and that's the framework that's established over his kahal, his assembly. and there's not multiple assemblies. We think that there are, because we have this modern view of churches and assemblies, and even in Revelation there's a letter to the seven assemblies or whatever. So yes, there are multiple assemblies as it pertains to being geographically spread around in local groups, but there really is only one assembly, one kahal of Yah, and that's his people. That's the bride of Messiah, and he establishes this leadership framework with men that are in these roles, but then within the assembly, we know that a body is consisting of many members, and every member of the body has a unique function and a role to fulfill. And not everybody is a foot, not everybody is an eye. We all have different roles to fulfill. But when you look at the word preacher, a preacher or somebody who proclaims, korah, to proclaim, to call out, to cry out, that word is more associated with preaching or proclaiming the truth, right? To be another word for preacher is found in Ecclesiastes, which is koheleth, and it's somebody who proclaims or who preaches in front of an assembly. So you can have a pastor of an assembly, and the pastor could preach. One of his roles in the assembly could be to preach to that assembly. One of them could be to be a teacher. One could be to prophesy, to be a prophet. I mean, so you can see that there's some overlap with these roles, the so-called fivefold ministry. I know there's more than five. I don't limit Yah to to five, just because that one verse has five there. But what I'm getting at is that there is some overlap, but we don't ever see a case where there's a woman in the scriptures that is exerting authority over man outside of the order that Yah's established.